Some of you probably already had sessions with me or have seen my name around the EATG email lists. My name is Daniel. The session today will be focused on advocacy in challenging environments, which is a very general and but also very interesting subject. And when I was preparing this, I was divided between having like trying to invest in let's say a strong theoretical background, but I decided against it because in fact it's very difficult to explain how to do advocacy because the environment means everything. So you can't really plan unless you know what you're doing exactly. So my thought process for this is to try and provide you with thinking process. So how do you set up your efforts? What do you need to think about? What do you need to consider? We're going to start with what I hope will be some interaction because your environments will make a difference for whatever it is you want to do. And I think it's nicer that we also get your feedback on what you think is important and what are the key issues in your work currently or your expected work. So this is a slide that I've been doing again. If you want to know more about my background, I strongly recommend that you click some of the links if you're not familiar with the names. I won't go through it. And we're going to start with what is a challenging environment. So it's a very general sentence or a very general expression. And what I'd like to know is, what do you consider a challenging environment? And please feel free to unmute and speak.
Difficult to approach.
So what is difficult? Concretely speaking, what can be difficult to approach?
Finding the people who are in this environment, somehow getting into interaction with them. Because I have no like solid example, but I can imagine we know that they exist, but we don't know where and how to find them.
So finding people. When you say people, you're referring to the people that you are working with, or do you mean the people that people who are in charge of decision making, for example?
No, the first option.
Okay. So finding the people who are, let's say, concerned about the issue. Okay. More?
I would say to not have any like control or authority over a certain situation. So that could be people, that could be physical situation, just not having that control in an environment.
Okay. And control and authority, I would say, are two very different things. Because control goes more into how things are managed and how things occur, and authority is actually having the power or to propose and make change happen. So it's two different dimensions, actually. More?
Environments with the I don't want to use the bad wording, with some
You can use bad words all you want, don't worry.
Legal issues.
Okay, so legal issues. So
for instance, I don't know, sex works is where the
exactly
is not allowed by law or something, or penalized.
So criminalization
and stigmatization also.
Stigma and discrimination.
Yes.
Two very important sides of sometimes the same coin, unfortunately, especially for a lot of the people who are most impacted by HIV. And these two, if you are not familiar with the expression, I would strongly advise you to look up something that is called enabling environments. It is a concept put forward also by international agencies, specifically UNAIDS, and it speaks exactly about this. So your environment and the way that your environment is set up makes an immense difference on access not only on behaviors, but also on access to services. And when we're speaking, as we are focusing on HIV and people impacted by HIV, when we're speaking about key populations, for example, these two issues of the legal and regulatory barriers on the one hand, but also the social part, so stigma, discrimination, the way that some people are seen in society, are often two of the most difficult challenges to overcome. First of all, because they are interconnected. And to give you a sentence that you'll probably hear me say a couple of times over the course of the session, policy is not usually determined by evidence, as you probably know. Political decisions, although evidence is thrown into the middle many times, most of political decisions are not made because there's evidence towards that decision. Political decisions are based on votes or on money, period. Usually both of them aligned. And so issues of stigma and discrimination, which link mostly to the way that society sees certain behaviors or certain groups of people, have an immense influence on the way that policy can or cannot change. And so if we're thinking about advocacy, communication and the way that you tackle these issues, the way that you put these issues into the public debate is often very, very important. And the case of sex workers, for example, is a very obvious case, but also the case of people using drugs. There is extensive evidence that legal and regulatory environments where these people are not criminalized is highly beneficial for the people in terms of their access to health, of their well-being. But in fact, the majority of the world still has repressive and, in many situations, criminalizing environments, mostly due to morale, which links with stigma and discrimination. So this is not an evidence-based policy. These are not evidence-based laws. It's morality. It's the reflection of you wanting to control all the behaviors that you, and you is a very general subject, so you in general society, think do not fit the norms. This unfortunately has repercussions in all aspects of society. So you can put forward all the evidence you want. I mean, I can give you a very practical example. We've been trying for several years in Portugal to improve our legislation around sex work and to regulate sex work in order to ensure that people who do commercial sex work have access to a series of things that they do not have at the moment. Although sex work is not illegal, so selling sex in Portugal is not illegal, provided you do it alone. So it's a one-to-one trade, but no one else can be involved. No one can profit from your sex. So you cannot set up an enterprise. You can't set up groups. You can't have a driver. You can't rent a house. You don't have access to social security, retirement, etc. So you have no rights, pretty much. You can do it, but it's your problem. And there are obviously political parties with different takes to the situation. And I remember that we had a meeting with the Communist Party, which tends to defend the rights of the working class, regardless of the working class. And the lady that was in the meeting told us, even if 100 years pass, we will never change our opinion about this subject. Sex work should not exist in society, period. And this is a clear reflection of an abolitionist background in the Communist Party, which puts this as the universal truth. So in a civilized society, for them, sex work should not exist. And so there is no other look into the subject, regardless of the problems people are facing. So the morality behind it overlaps whatever evidence and whatever rights people have. So it's actually against the DNA of the party, and it's something that's based on a very moralistic base, theoretical basis. This exists all throughout and in many, many different subjects, so it's always something to look out for. If your society is very conservative, you will probably have a lot of issues discussing sex-related matters, regardless of if it's heterosexual sex, homosexual sex, bisexual, pansexual, or whatever. If you have a very religious society, you will probably have the same issues, because religion tends to be associated with well, let's say decreased sexual liberties, to use a more politically correct expression. More things that can make an environment challenging to work on.
The lack of access to actual decision-making spaces.
Good one. Which links to the not having control or authority over the situation. So if you can't reach the people who make the decisions, it's many times difficult to actually make things change, or even to put the subject for discussion. More things? Let me give you a few basic ones. How about war? Do you think working in a war context is something that's easy?
Not really.
I don't. Famine. Natural disasters. And I know these seem kind of very broad, but the fact of the matter is that famine, for example, well, we're facing kind of a natural disaster, although it's not exactly, well, it is a disaster, but not in the classical sense. The pandemic has put forward a situation where working on anything else is extremely challenging because everyone is only, well, for the most part, the majority of people are only focusing on responding to the pandemic in one way or the other. And if we're thinking about famine, for example, famine exists in every country in the world. And if we're trying to push something, even with people, let's go back to the calculations, even if we're speaking about, and I'll give you an example again from Portugal, we have a lot of people from Portuguese-speaking African countries. We have migration to and from Portuguese-speaking African countries for centuries now. And a lot of the people who migrate from these countries are people who do not have a very strong economic background. So they are living in very, very precarious situations. Now, if you're trying to raise awareness about specific issues, people sometimes don't care, not because they don't want to care, but because in fact, they have many, many more pressing priorities in their lives than actually worrying about health even. So health, unless you're really, unless it's a really, really serious problem, health is not your main problem. HIV is not your main problem. Your civil rights are not your main problem. Your main problem is you need to eat. You need a place to live. You need transportation money to go to work. And so basic needs in general can make a lot of things very, very hard. More things. Go to basics if you want. Language. Again, in the same issue. And language, I'll tell you that it's not just knowing the language of the country that you are at, is actually being able to speak with people in different places. If you're speaking to a researcher, I mean, in my case, I often have to completely change the way that I speak when I'm talking to a researcher, a policymaker, a person from a community organization, or a person from some key populations. So it's not just the language itself, it's how you speak, how you communicate your issues. And when you're thinking about advocacy, this makes a very, very big difference because the way that you address people and the way that you speak can completely open or close doors to you. More things.
Political option, whoever the government is.
Exactly. So if you have a right-wing government, you will probably have a series of difficulties working on some subjects, whereas if you have a left-wing government, you'll probably have some difficulties working on another series of issues. So no one is perfect, obviously, but and as we have been seeing a rise on far-right governments over the last few years, not only in Europe but also in Europe, conservative governments, more right-wing oriented policies, our areas, and sorry for using the general our areas, but issues around access to health of marginalized populations, etc., become much harder to engage in debate because it's not a part of the political priority of the political agendas. So the agendas are again an issue, and agendas linked to economy, for example, not only on your economical state, but the way that you see economy working. They link to your own health systems. If you have a public-based health system, there are some discussions that are much easier than when you have a private-based health system. Fortunately for us in Europe, the vast majority of health systems are public-based, by opposition with other countries. But again, the system organization itself makes a massive difference. And when we're speaking about people, it's very important to remember that people are not boxes. So we tend to say, I'll go back again to the key population, sex workers. But sex workers are not just sex workers. They are men, women, trans people. They are from a ton of different countries. They have an eternity of backgrounds in terms of education. They have different ages. They're mothers, fathers, grandparents, some of them, etc., etc. So the person is a complex thing. And when your system is organized, as the majority of systems are organized, very vertically, when you're speaking about HIV, you only speak about HIV, you don't speak about everything else. And so when you take forward one issue, let's say that we're going with the decriminalization of sex work, decriminalizing sex work has an impact in a lot of different areas, but often when you're speaking to someone, that person will be focused on one specific area. So it's hard to have a wider conversation, even when we're speaking with decision makers. And you have a multitude of angles that you can approach the subject from. You can go to it from an economic standpoint because it brings more money in taxes. You can go from a health standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, but it's really, really hard to sit with someone and the person actually understanding the full range of issues that decriminalizing sex work implies. Most people focus on their own work, and it's up to us to oftentimes open the eyes of the other person to the range of things that this are the issue that we're taking forward impacts. More things?
Religion, I would say.
Religion, yes, definitely.
If we're talking about sex work, for example, having political enemies, even in other civil society organizations.
Exactly. And I mean, if in policy it's to be expected at a policy decision level, because you always have representation from different sides of the political spectrum, it complicates it a lot when civil society itself has a very fragmented position. And in the case of sex work, that's very true. You have very strong abolitionist movements who defend that sex work simply should not exist, and that every person who does sex work is a victim of exploitation. I won't deny that there are victims of exploitation, but they're not the majority, that I can assure you. But this is also the truth in a lot of other issues. Let's say drug policy, for example. There are organizations in many different countries which defend criminalization and heavy penalties for people who use drugs, regardless of evidence. Again, more things?
And I think in general, I mean, for example, from my experience from the past, like generally speaking, like internalized stigma within one community that shouldn't be inclusive, like the LGBT community should be inclusive, for example, for trans. It's often not the case, and I think it's a real challenge.
Very true. We've seen that in Portugal, actually, with the LGBT rights. Exactly as you were mentioning. And even for adoption, for example, there were segments of the LGBT community who were not really convinced that same-sex adoption was something that should be regulated. But actually, the most clear example was previous to that, around post the laws that criminalize discrimination based on sexual orientation. A lot of and for a lot of years, a lot of LGBT community organizations had wanted to have nothing to do with health, with HIV specifically. So you couldn't speak about HIV and infectious diseases with LGBT organizations because they didn't want to have anything to do with that discussion, because their fear was that there would be such a huge load of stigma on top of the society, on top of their community, that it would throw away the focus from the rights issue. Fortunately, that has changed over the last few years, but that's a very important point in many cases. More things? No? Okay, so then for the moment we can call it. And I mean, I think that the overall conclusion is when you think about whatever environment, there will always be challenges. And these challenges come at different levels, from different people, and have different shapes. So before we move on, I want to give you two more questions, which are the challenges in your own environments and well, not the challenges themselves, because that will go further ahead, but what is it that you are trying to do within Step Up? So what do you want to try and put forward, change, or implement? And again, please feel free to unmute and speak. You can start with any of them.
Yeah. In the challenge I'm trying to face in my environment is fighting for stigma within also healthcare providers, because I seem to experience it more often this past few years.
Okay, very well. So stigma on healthcare is a very current topic, actually. We can go back to that further ahead. And that's that links also with your project in Step Up?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I didn't ask if you already had defined the projects or not. Sorry. I thought I presumed you already have an idea, but it's not mandatory. In case you do, just.
I would say stigma as well, and self-stigma, because I'm working with people living with HIV who are just diagnosed, and trying to reach out to them is not easy, because there must be some willingness from them to speak. So that's a bit tough. And in terms of trying to change, I would say it's sort of the next step would be trying to build a community of people living with HIV, because we don't really have any. So there is no community-based self-care, I would say.
Okay. What country are you from? Sorry.
Poland.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of challenges there.
I know.
And Elian, you are based, or you are from?
I am in Netherlands.
Netherlands.
Originally, I'm from Burundi.
Ah. Bit easier in some senses to work in the Netherlands than Poland, not so much in other senses though. Sometimes it's funny because sometimes countries who are more, let's say, advanced think that they've already done everything that they need to do. So actually putting new things forward can become quite a big challenge.
And that's definitely a challenge I'm facing here in Iceland. So we have under 500 AIDS and HIV people, and therefore the government don't think it's a big problem. So within the communities, we're very lucky. We've had people that have been living with HIV for 25 plus years. And this is a very Icelandic community, but they don't really include any migrants. They don't include anyone who doesn't speak Icelandic. So there's different communities that are not being reached, and that's definitely something that I'm trying to bring together. And then also the way Iceland tests. So you can only get a HIV test if you go into the healthcare system. And that's just not practical for many other people unless you're an Icelandic resident.
So do you access the healthcare system if you're not legal in Iceland?
No, we don't have any undocumented migrants.
Are you sure? I've heard many countries say that, but in fact, that's never I haven't met one country that actually has 0 undocumented migrants. I know countries that have very few, but
official reports, they have 0, but from personal experience, I know of 3. So
it's not 0. 3 is different than 0. So there you go. I mean, of course, that obviously, if you say how many undocumented migrants do you have, majority of countries will say, will be smart enough to say we don't know. we don't think it's a big problem, but we don't know. In countries where undocumented migration is very frequent, obviously people start to develop estimates, but in more remote countries where, and well, more inhospitable countries, which is the case of Iceland, to where migration is not that common, so irregular migration is not that frequent, that narrative can happen, which is we don't have a problem, they don't exist. I've heard colleagues of mine from some African countries, for example, when we were discussing issues around trans people, and people from community-based organizations telling me, no, we don't have trans people in our country. Oh, really? Obviously they do. The thing is, it's something that you don't actively look for, and thus it is a reality that for you does not exist. And that sometimes it's the first big barrier to break down. And in Iceland, I presume that the language isn't exactly the easiest thing to pick up, similarly to the most Nordic languages. So, yeah. Okay. So this gives us a nice introductory chat. So I'm gonna, time is 35. Okay. I'm gonna take the next roughly 15 minutes to go through thought process. So when you're thinking about a problem, how do you think about the problem? Or, I mean, I'm not going to teach you how to think. I presume you all know how to think. The idea is just to give you some aspects that might be important to consider when you are trying to develop, although some of these things are for project implementation, depending on the projects. Again, it's focused on advocacy initiatives. So from there, we go back to conversation. Okay. So when we are trying to change something, the basics is we really need to know what we're trying to change. So the first point is obviously identifying what the issue is. Second very important point, which is often skipped, is identifying what do we know and what do we want to show. And these are two different things. So the what do we know is not just what do we know in our own setting, is what do we know in general. It's going back to the evidence that already exists, looking at things that were similar that were already done in other places. It's kind of the research equivalent of the literature review. So we look around, we see what the agencies tell us, we see what evidence exists. And then when we have our issue and when we have the evidence base, we have to clearly define what do we want to show. And this may seem very obvious, but it's not that obvious. Usually advocacy I've seen a lot of advocacy efforts that are so general that when you actually manage to get, let's say, a hearing with a decision maker, you're speaking about 20 different things. And if you're speaking about 20 different things, your message will disappear. It's really, really critical to have very concrete messages on what you want to change. Why are you there? Which is the next point. What is your objective? And why do you want to change whatever it is you're proposing? What's the relevance for you? What's the relevance for the people that it concerns? And what's the relevance for the decision maker itself or the person that you're speaking to? It doesn't have to be necessarily a decision maker. It can be the lead of your organization. It can be your mayor. It can be the owner of a company. It doesn't matter. Clarity, it touches again on the communication here. Clarity is absolutely critical. After identifying what issue, what we know about it, what we want to show or change, and why we want to show or change, we have to identify to who are we taking this and how will we take it. And we go back to the issue of the lack of space, for example, for civil society and decision-making settings, which is very common all around the world. If we identify the who, and I'll go to the identification part just after this, we have to find out how we get there. And how we get there is not usually that obvious, but also the who is not always that obvious. It's not just who has the power, because if that's the case, you always go to the head of your government, because in theory, the head of the government can change anything he or she wants. It's actually who is the person that can grab your issue and make something happen. And that's the person or the people, it doesn't have to be one, that's the person or people that you have to convince. And it's not always easy to identify. And then how will you get there? How will you make that person change? And people react to very different things. As I mentioned earlier, decision makers usually react to one of two things: votes or money. So if you are taking something to a policymaker, if it's something, let's say, well, I'll give you a concrete example. We've been working in Portugal for several years now towards decriminalizing cannabis for personal use. It's been a interesting but long journey, and it will continue to be a journey because we don't expect it to change this year. But we already identified several people in a few different political parties that we could anchor on to get some proposals going. And proposals did get to the government, but they were failed in the parliament. They were not approved. It's the issue here. We're setting up a new plan now for this year. Actually, it's set up, we're putting it in place. And one of the critical things that we had to consider regarding the how, which is also connected to the when, this is also a very key point that I actually forgot to put here, and I'll add, is we're going to have elections for municipalities further up ahead in the year. And so when campaigning starts for municipalities, no one wants to be discussing drug policy. No one, because it's going to be a problem. And regardless of what your position is, it can make you lose votes. So in terms of political risk for people, since it's a very fracturing subject, it's impossible to put this forward in the political agenda over the next few months until the election time is finished. After that, we're going to have the state budget negotiations. And that may be slightly easier because we can put forward the economic argument that if you regulate this, you have X estimated extra million to put in the state budget. So the timing, although it's just 2 months apart, can make a very, very big difference. And how you frame the issue and how you get to people is also quite different. So in this case, we've been working with, on the one hand, obviously our connections in political parties that we know are favorable to the concept. But the political parties all have, so when you say regulate, we have people in pretty much all parties in Portugal that are in the government that say, yeah, regulating is a good idea, but then how you regulate is another problem. So your approach to the subject has to change depending on which political party you're speaking to, although you're speaking exactly about the same issue. But on one example, so we have two big parties, which is the one center left and one center right. For the center, well, for both of them, actually, you have a segment of people who actually are in favor, and you have a segment of people who are more conservative and who are against it. And we've obviously managed to get in touch with the people who are in favor. We have also spoken to a couple of them who are against. And actually what we're trying to get is not that people are in favor, it's just that they are not against, so that they abstain. And if they abstain, in our scenario, the way we're setting things up, abstention is enough. So that also changes how we go towards and speak to people. We, the last 2 points are pretty self-explanatory, but we have to be wary of what resources we have. And it's not just the money, it's so if we have a network of people who are willing to give us some time to work on the issue, that's often worth a lot more than having money in our pocket, because those people will have contacts. They will be able to get us in contact with other people who are relevant. And who can help us is obviously, invaluable. And we're so invaluable that we actually have a session on networking exactly because of that. And we're speaking obviously about community people and organizations, but also about agencies and key opinion makers. And often key opinion makers are not very much taken into consideration, or community-based organizations tend to work in communication very focused in our own communities and projects. And if we're thinking about advocacy efforts, many of these issues are very fracturing in society. I mean, drug use is not something that societies in the world are very comfortable discussing. Most people say, oh, no, drugs are bad, period. The discussion doesn't go very much beyond this. Same thing with sex work. People have an opinion already made, but people don't have evidence. People still saying that COVID vaccines can alter your genes. So the overall crowd mentality does not have a very high IQ. Sorry to put it that way, but I mean, the public opinion in general is not a very informed opinion. So for discussing issues that are very controversial, we really need to be able to generate constructive public debate. This is good not only for the education of the public opinion, but also so that, again, if it's discussed in a constructive way, when your politicians have to decide, they will have much less fear of losing votes because the public opinion is much more comfortable with the subject. And here, the key opinion leaders are extremely important. I mean, if you find, let's go to the drug policy example because it's the one that's fresher in my head. We've found judges, economists, even people connected with religion that are okay defending publicly that cannabis should be regulated for personal use. And they are from very different political specters, and they are people who are kind of untouchable. There are people with a lot of history. They've proven themselves in political positions, or they have very good professional careers. There are people who are respected in their respective sectors, from conservatives to liberals, etc. And so if you get a good set of these people, which is not always possible, this is a good example because I mean we were fortunate to have a contact network which allows us to identify them, but this isn't always possible. But if you manage to have this, it will make your job much easier, because if you have people who are kind of, again, untouchable, going forward into public national media and saying, no, this is a good idea, it completely changes the way that the discourse is taken over by the media. Because the risk is, obviously, media want to sell newspapers. Again, it's money. And so whatever the issue is, they'll try to make a fuss out of it. They'll try to create confusion. They'll try to get everyone that's against your opinion or the opinion that's being discussed. They will try to create problems because that's how they sell. And if you manage to have a good wall of people who support this in a very organized way, it makes your job much easier, and it makes the sensationalist media's work much harder. So when we're thinking about identifying issues, this is very, very basic. But actually often a lot of people skip this, and this can make or break the way that you're planning things. We need to clearly identify what the issue is. And I mean, these are not exclusive categories. It can be all the ones who are there, depending on what we're discussing. But we need to identify what the issue is, where or who the issue is, because sometimes the issue is a person that's blocking a process. And that may be much easier than if it's an institution that, for example, doesn't even care about your subject. And I can give you the example of the Ministry of Health, which has a million different priorities. HIV is one amongst I don't know how many. Now in times of COVID, even worse. And so if you go forward with something related to health that doesn't have to do with COVID, the likelihood that that's going to end up in one of their drawers and no one will look at it for 5 years is very, very high. And that's not active opposition. And that it's very different when you have someone or person or institution actively opposing what you're proposing, or if it's just something that people don't care because they don't think it's important, or because they have other more important things to look out for. And in these cases, sometimes, again, key opinion leaders, and if we're speaking about HIV, for example, the key doctors, or even people who have been previously connected to high-profile positions in the ministries, like people who have a history or have a good CV, or researchers who have a good name, etc., can be very nice people to actually increase the popularity of your issue wherever it is it has to go to. Sometimes the tendency is always to go to the top of the decision chain. And I hate to disappoint you if you don't know it yet, but ministers often have absolutely no idea of what the technical staff is discussing. They just go and make the public appearances. They have 3 or 4 lines of a briefing about the subject, and they're usually people who do the public part. The people who do the work usually is the technical staff of the cabinet. And often it's easier if you have a good connection with someone from the technical side Because if you can convince that person, he or she will probably manage to put that on his desk instead of on his drawer, and that can save you 5 years. I mean, it's a conceptual thing, but it's very true, and we've seen evidence of this. If you can go through whoever it is, even if it's someone lower in the decision chain, and that person can just put the paper in the right table at the right time, this can save you countless hours of work and endless amounts of time. Which links again to the last part, which is who can solve it. And the who can solve it has the two sides. So who makes the decision? And how do you get to the person who makes the decision? Because often, even if it is that person who makes the decision, it's going to be very difficult to get to the person or to convince the person, and so you have to go around. Again, this is mostly focused on advocacy, but you can try to do the same exercise with non-advocacy issues. To give you a few examples of some common barriers, I think we've touched upon a few of them. And this is focused mostly on infectious diseases, on our infectious diseases. Fear is a very, very big concern. And fear comes in more ways than I would imagine initially. There is fear of losing your job. There is fear of suddenly, on the drug side, there was realistic fear of some people that if you regulate, then everyone will start using drugs and the country will collapse. It's completely unreal, but it's unreal in reality. In people's mind, this can be true. The same for sex work. There are people who genuinely fear if they regulate sex work, then suddenly there will be an explosion in the amount of people who will either do or pay for sex, which again, from the models that we've seen that regulated did not happen, but this is real in people's minds. What we build in our minds, unfortunately, is not always connected to the reality. But there's also fear of change and fear of work. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the world has fear of work. They already have enough work to keep them entertained, and so more work is a problem. And changing things requires work. And so if you're proposing a big change, people will anticipate that this will be a huge workload, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. So this is also an important factor to consider when you're proposing something. If you can explain that you're proposing something, but actually this won't translate into a bigger workload, into spending more money, etc., it makes the decision process much easier. Another issue that's very, very common is that we need to speak about things that are uncomfortable to people. Speaking about gay men, trans people, I can go worse, like fisting, chemsex, etc. It's not something that the Minister of Health or a doctor is very used to doing. And although for us, some of these issues in our work are common issues, and so we're comfortable discussing them in, let's say, a formal or informal way, for the vast majority of the population, even discussing sex or sexual orientation is a very, very difficult thing. And you can see that with all of the reports of homophobia that are still around. The same is valid for drug use, even for migration. And if we're speaking about HIV, viral hepatitis, tuberculosis, people have no idea what these infections are. They've heard half a dozen things throughout their lives, but the majority of people are not as well informed as we are. Not even close. And so people have a lot of misconceptions. And it's difficult to speak with people who have no idea what you're talking about. And so for the most part, it is also up to us, and this goes back to the issue that I was mentioning about the public debate. It falls upon us to actually increase the low level of IQ of the public opinion, especially in meetings. If we have a meeting, we really need to set the scene. It has to be, because we cannot presume that everyone else has the same knowledge that we do, because we work on that subject. Other people don't. And it's our job, our responsibility, if we're trying to change something, to make sure that people at least understand the basics of what they're telling them. Two of the most common barriers are time and resources. Again, if we speak about decision makers, the majority of them have hundreds of requests for meetings, so we're just one more. And it's a hard task sometimes to stop being one more and start being that guy or that lady. And this can make a change. And it made a change for us over the last decade. We stopped from being one more community organization to, in the case of GATT, to being GATT. And it took us many, many hours of work, many meetings, hundreds of emails over the years. It's a very long process, but it's possible. Obviously, you have to adjust it to the government that you have, the people that you're speaking to, the subjects that you're working on. It requires work, but it is possible. And resource-wise, again, people always concerned that when they change something, it will cost them a lot of money. So it's important that if it costs a lot of money, it has to be clear that it will cost money, but it also has to be clear what it will bring. If it doesn't cost a lot of money, it's even more important that it's clear. Because if you tell people there's an opportunity here to do X, or whatever X is, and it will cost you a couple hundred, well, couple 100,000 is well, not that little, but in the overall budget of a government, it's not that much either. Or it will cost you a couple tens of thousands, and your outcome can be this outcome. I don't know, even for testing projects, that's how you sell projects, right? You invest 50,000 euros in my project, but I can, I don't know, diagnose 200 people living with HIV. There's a good, in the person's mind, there's a good return for investment. And this is very important because it helps facilitate the decision process. Again, lack of information or expertise on how to implement solutions is very common, even at high levels. At a ministry level, at a government level, we always presume that the people who are there are very wise and very competent. Often that's not the case. They're just there because, well, I won't go into details, but I mean, you've all spoken to people in various positions, so you know very well that just because the person has position X doesn't mean the person is competent or knows a lot about subject X or Y. So again, really important that we frame the issue and the way, and it also gives us an opportunity to frame it like we want. Because think about it, I mean, the other person doesn't know much about it, so we can sell it as we prefer. Then if they want to go check, it's up to them. If they don't, what they will get is our version of the story, which can be beneficial for us. Another common barrier, especially in health, is corporate protection. And this is connected to fear of losing jobs, benefits, privileges. It's very common at a medical level. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of medical communities in several countries is very resistant to task shifting, even task shifting things that they shouldn't be doing in the first place. I'll give you the example of Portugal. Epidemiological inquiries in Portugal for whatever infectious disease could only be done by specialist public health doctors until last year. And there were several attempts to try and get other people to do that and other health tasks, but let's focus on this one. So imagine that you need a doctor who studied for the full medicine course, so that's 6 years, plus 3 years at least of the specialty. So they're public health specialists. They're not even interns. They finished everything. And these are the only people that can fill an epidemiological questionnaire that can be filled by a 4th grade person, if the person is trained. It's like 12 questions. And there was a huge resistance to this because it was a specific task for that specialty. And so if they lost that, they would lose control over, well, they say that it's because it's quality issues, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of justifications, some of them more valid than others. But this is very common in many places. It's the issue that we faced similarly when we were discussing implementation of community-based HIV testing. There was a huge resistance from health professionals, not only because they were afraid that we would screw up, but also because they would lose their privilege of being the only people who could provide that service. Now it's more than institutionalized in Portugal, but it was one of the big barriers at the time. The medical community was very active against it. What they said, again, was issues around quality, blah, blah, blah. But this corporate protection was also there. And this is something we really need to keep in mind. Again, lack of political will or interest, which is especially concerning in times of COVID again. And prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. And again, the general IQ of the public opinion is not the best. And there is a lot of institutionalized prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. The Roma community in Portugal is horribly seen at the eyes of the public, the Gypsy community. They are seen as the people who are sucking up social security money. They're all dependent on the state, blah, 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 where in fact they represent like 2% of the expenditure. And the proportion of Roma people who actually, or Gypsy because they're not Roma, but original Roma from Romania, the gypsy families who receive, the proportion who receive support from the state is pretty much the same of any other ethnicity. So it's really prejudice that's institutionalized, and it's really hard to break it even with data, because the data doesn't reach mass media. What reaches mass media is the gypsy guy that killed someone, or the gypsy guy that was caught dealing drugs, or so you only get the bad examples on the media. You don't get the good ones. It's very rare that you get the good ones, which tends to support the idea that there are a lot of bad people in that community, similarly to other communities. Unfortunately, mass media, again, wants to sell, so they want to push whatever it is makes them get more people watching or more newspapers out. So, in terms of process thinking, and this is a session on its own, which I will not do today, but there's a very important question, which is, do we need data ourselves for whatever it is we're doing? Yes or no? And this is a very, very important question, because generating data has a series of other processes to it. If yes, we need to think about what questions are we asking? How are we asking them? So a lot of questions, few questions, language issues, getting the right information from each question. Sometimes people think that asking a lot of questions means we get a lot of information. Wrong. If we can get the key information in 5 questions, we'll get a lot more people responding, if provided we can get to the people, than if we have 50 questions. Because if you have 50 questions, you have a lot of people that will not answer, because it's 50 questions, it's a long time. Choosing the right way to get the right people, sampling, and especially sampling, as Greg was mentioning initially, like how you ensure that you get to the people that you actually want to get to. So choosing the right channels, engaging with the right mediators, let's say, to actually reach the communities that you want to reach. So scale and size, if we're speaking about minority populations, whatever the minority population is, all of the key populations are minority populations. So people who use drugs are not the majority. Well, if we consider alcohol and tobacco, probably they are, but people who use drugs that are not regulated are not the majority. Sex workers are not the majority. Migrants are not the majority, et cetera, et cetera. And so we don't really need massive samples, but we need a sample that's sufficient enough to prove our point. And that leads us to kind of finding a way to using whatever resources we have and making the most out of it. And often we don't need a lot of money, and we don't need a lot of time. We just need to identify resources correctly. If, let's say, if I'm a drug user, I know a lot of other drug users. And so if I want to ask questions to people who use drugs, I can use my channels, my networks, and my friends, or the people that I know who use drugs, they also know people. So if I can leverage my own networks, I don't really need an expert, a scientific expert to tell me how to get there. Actually, I teach scientific experts how to get there. And that's the case in many research projects, where you have community telling researchers, how can you get to these people or those people? And something very important that often community organizations don't really do is you document the process. You document your barriers. You tell the whole story. Because sometimes in the story, there are very important details, such as barriers, for example. Why do people who use drugs often don't come forward in a lot of countries? Well, because they can get arrested. And so it's obvious that they won't be answering surveys, or that they won't be telling you that they use drugs if you go to a doctor. If you are a criminal for using drugs, you'll hide it as much as possible unless you trust the person. And telling this as a part of the story is important. It also reflects your own barriers and difficulties. If you don't need to get data, you need an evidence base. So if you don't need to get data, it's because data already exists. It doesn't have to be data from your setting, as long as it's good data. So are there recommendations from agencies or from your own national bodies, scientific publications, guidelines, expert opinions, whatever you can find? Build a good evidence base, regardless, because it helps you make your opinion better, more solid. So the evidence base gives you what you already know. Ideally, you want case studies, because presenting examples often, especially for people who are not very informed, presenting case examples is an easy way for a person to have a concrete idea of how things can work, and touch on or find evidence around cost or price if applicable and relevant for your issue. Again, this would be a whole session around each of these topics. I'm not going to go through them, but if you need any support around discussing issues of data, let me know by email and we can discuss. So a very loaded slide. This is a sum up of what's been happening, of what we've been discussing so far. And this, if you want to hold one slide from all of this, hold this one, because it's kind of the flow. So you have your data, now what? So you have to know what needs to change and why. Is it policy? Is it law? Is it regulation? Is it practice? Be concrete, get a plan. Always suggest solutions. Don't just present a problem. If you get the opportunity to explain your point of view to someone, take a solution. And I'm sorry for being presumptuous here, but take this advice for your life. If you're discussing a problem, think of a solution, even if it's a stupid one. Think of a way that the problem could be solved, because it puts you on the right track instead of focusing on the problem. I mean, if you just present the problem, the odds of spending hours discussing the various angles of the problem are very high. If you present the problem and you throw in a solution, even if it's a slightly unrealistic one, it ends with focusing on a way that the problem could be solved. And it changes the way that you can then moderate the discussion from there onward. Whenever possible, use agencies. That's what they exist for. If UNAIDS has a recommendation, or WHO or ECDC, those are your go-to places. You always look for these first, because it's the World Health Organization. I'm just saying the same thing WHO is saying. And it will make it very, very hard for people to disagree. Well, at least some people. If they believe vaccines can alter your DNA, they can also disagree with WHO, so it's fine. At what level do you need to make change? Is this local, national, international? Because it completely, obviously, it changes your efforts completely. Who are the people who make the decision, and who influences that decision? Your allies, your supporters. You have to always expect resistance. I have not found in my life so far one issue that is unanimous in society. So there will always be people against you. That's fine. It's part of the fun of it. If everyone was in favor, you wouldn't need to do anything. How do you reach these people? Communication, so media, public hearings, public demonstrations, social media, formal meetings, informal meetings. Do you have to go to your ministry? Do you have to go to your mayor? Can you do this in your community? Do you need media to cover it? If so, can you organize a demonstration? Like classical stuff, people going out with posters, making noise in front of the parliament or the city hall. What can work to get you attention? But good attention. And this sometimes is the hard balance, because you want people to notice your issue. You do not want people to, missing the word in English, you don't want people to hate you because of your issue. And this is sometimes a hard balance, because if you do a huge demonstration with hundreds of people, it's very good to raise awareness to the issue, but actually can generate resistance. It's not it's not guaranteed. It obviously depends on the issue, on your political climate, etc. And sometimes it is the only way to actually get things forward. Sometimes if you don't get people on the street, nothing will happen. And so this always has to be on the back of your mind, because it's quite likely that, I mean, I can go to the case of Poland, issues around LGBT rights are only kept in the agenda if you keep making noise, because otherwise the government, with the orientation that the government is having at the moment, if the government is kept, the tendency will be for decreasing space or for decreasing rights and not for increasing rights, which should be the tendency overall. So it is necessary to keep the issues on the agenda. Sometimes the only way to keep issues on the agenda is by making a lot of noise, but noise is noise. And so noise can generate interference and can increase resistance. So here it's something that you have to assess in your own setting. I can't give you a formula for that. Think about language and communication. Keep things as simple as possible, because again, people are not informed. People don't know as much as you do, hopefully. I mean, if they know more, then it's also nice, but for the most part, people will not know a lot about the issues that you're taking them. Prepare your communication for your audience. If you're speaking to a researcher, you have to prepare things in one way. If you're speaking to a politician, you have to prepare it in another. If you're speaking to media, you have to prepare it in another. And there are tricks for that I mean, they're not very hard to find online. For the most part, if you're speaking to media, you cannot be ambiguous, because they can manipulate and sometimes it's not a bad intent. They want to sell, so they'll just do some small changes or pick up the part of the sentence. I'll give you a concrete example. I gave an interview recently about an article that I published on the impact of COVID and infectious diseases for a national newspaper. And I spoke for 15 minutes with a journalist. And obviously, she didn't translate the 15 minutes of the interview. She didn't put everything in the interview. So the article was relatively short. And she picked up my one quote where instead of saying people who inject drugs, I said drug users. But the word in Portuguese for drug users, it doesn't exactly translate as drug users. It translates into drug addicts, which is toxicodependent, so dependent on substances. So the one time I said that for 15 minutes, she picked up that quote. And actually, it was my bad, because I used correct language all throughout, and that one I was speaking quickly. As you probably noticed, I tend to accelerate my speech. And she picked that one up because it's more impactful to have that written, plus it's only one word, by opposition to people who inject drugs, which is more words and it's more formal. She didn't do it out of bad intention, because the article was actually very nicely written. But I mean, it's less words, it has more impact, etc. So language is really important. For politicians, same thing. And obviously, you need to be more formal with politicians, unfortunately, unless you know them very well, in which case, well, you can be more comfortable. If you're speaking to researchers, you have to take your evidence base well prepared, preferably. So adjust. Financial implications, be as aware as possible, again, of financials around things, and time. Whatever it is, even if it's the most basic thing in the world, very, very few things change quickly. Change is a really difficult process. People tend to be resistant to change, even if they know that it's changing for the better, because change requires work and effort, and most people don't want to put in a lot of effort. I'm sorry for being pessimistic on this one, but I mean, it's also from my experience. You will also find people who do want to change and who do want to change things for the better. And those people are very good to keep, especially if you find them in your decision-making circles. Sometimes they pop up. If you find them, keep their contacts and work with them as much as you can. Usually, changing things is a very, very long and frustrating process. To sum up, last couple of slides. And going back to this issue of frustration, if you have a will, there is a way. So if you really are invested in making something happen, there's a way to do it. It's possible that you have to try a million times, but there will be a way. You just have to find it. So not giving up is very important. But also, and this is, I really like the author, and I love this quote, because, I mean, I don't know if you guys have the habit of whenever it's New Year, you look back on your year and you think, like, what happened? So usually for me, throughout the year, everything seems exactly the same. Nothing really seems to change except in like very specific events. But actually, when you look back 1 year or 5 years, your life is completely different. Even if on a day-by-day basis, it seems that everything is always the same thing, or nothing really changes that much. Things do change, but we often don't realize that things are evolving. And in advocacy processes, this is very true. So check, so be clear and realistic on your goals. So try and start, if it's a very big thing that you're trying, try to have more concrete, smaller goals, because they will also give you a few small victories, which are important to fight frustration. But also be wary of small things that you manage to do. If you can convince someone that was against you that your opinion is actually valid, that's a very big win, because that can have a ripple effect throughout time that you cannot foresee. We tend to put very, very high expectations and goals, and that acts often against us. I mean, if you want to change something at a national level, I mean, I've known people who've been in the government for 8 years and they haven't managed to change anything at a national level. So we really need to be, yes, ambitious, but also realistic and objective. And sometimes small wins can transform into big wins over time. Also, do your best not to work alone whenever possible. Identify whatever allies you can, not just because it makes it easier, but also because it makes it less frustrating. Do not hesitate to reach out to other organizations. I mean, you have EATG, there are a ton of organizations and networks in Europe. Agencies are there to support us. WHO, ECDC, they may seem very much out of reach, they are not. Contact them if necessary, ask for help. Don't hesitate. If you're collecting data, in any case, it's critical that people understand why you are collecting that data and why their opinion matters. It changes everything in the process, and it engages people a lot more. And lastly, and this again is for all your work, always involve the people who are concerned on the issue that you're discussing in the whole process, in planning, in discussing, in identifying strategies, and identifying objectives, etc. Because sometimes we can think that we know something, but the people who know something better are the people who actually go through it. And this goes back to what I was saying before. There are many competing agendas and interests. You will very, very rarely be the top priority of the person, or your issue will very rarely be the top priority of the person that you're trying to convince. So you need to expect not to be successful at the first try. You need to be open to criticism and to different points of view, but you also need to keep track of your ultimate goal. And if you're still certain that your goal is right, do not waver. Don't give up. Try another strategy, speak to more people, look with people with different experiences from different backgrounds, etc. Fail better. You can fail a million times. Just keep getting better at every go. And that's it for the presentation. Now, I am going to give you 5 minutes to recompose from hearing me speak for the last 45 minutes or 40 minutes. So we can all stretch for a bit, and we will be back in 5 minutes to continue the conversation. Is that okay for everyone? Okay,
Yep.
Perfect. So see you in 5. First, well, question, let's say, is do you have questions, comments, feedback? Did you find this at all useful? Is there anything that you'd like to clarify? And I know that a lot of these things are pretty theoretical. Some are a bit more practical, but as I said in the beginning, it's really difficult to so when you're thinking about advocacy, it's really difficult to give you a concrete thing of you do A, B, C, and D, because it will always depend on your context and on the issue that you're working on. So feel free to ask questions, ask for more clarity on things, ask for more examples, etc. Yeah?
No, I think you pretty much covered everything that we would need to know. So as you were going through a couple of the points, I was like, okay, yeah, that's going to be really relevant for my situation, but there's going to be other times for a different country that it's going to be different. So one thing that I'm looking at, so here in the healthcare, the government are really putting their efforts into the UN development goals, and that's tied into their healthcare profession. So I'm trying to get my research. So HIV comes under number 3 of their health goals. So as long as I can connect that, I think that's how I would be best to approach them, to say, look, it fits into your goals, it fits into the UN program, you've already set a budget. So that was quite helpful to think that I'm on the right track. So thank you.
And if you want a bit more background on that, so the SDGs, as you know, is the global framework. So it's also something very broad. They try to, well, they didn't try, they actually operationalized a series of specific targets. But actually, then the SDGs are unfolded into a series of other guidance, recommendations, etc. And for advocacy initiatives, it's important that you keep those in mind as well. So I can point you to a few of them concretely, which are of relevance to Iceland because they're WHO Europe or Europe in general. And those include the Global Health Sector Action Plans for HIV. They include the new UNAIDS framework, which will be coming out this year, but there's already a draft out there in the UNAIDS website that you can check, which will give you, so it will update the 90-90-90 with new targets from 2025 onward. And it has a lot of targets that are connected to communities. So it will be really relevant, in my opinion, for all of our work, because it for the first time, UNAIDS is not just focusing on the epidemiological indicators, as was the case in the 1990s, although there was a target on stigma. They're also focusing on social dynamics, so on issues around enabling environments, issues on criminalization, issues on access, etc. So the overall framework is a lot more comprehensive, and I think it's very, very nice. And obviously, you can go to the ECDC guidelines, which the new guidelines are integrated for HIV and viral hepatitis, but they really touch upon the importance of offering different testing modalities, as you were referring to testing earlier. And they touch on the importance of community providers as a part of the response system. And for systems who are very focused on the medical side, this can help at least give the framing that the agencies actually recommend that regardless of your system, because I mean, and that the baseline is always the same. No system is perfect, regardless of how good you are. There's always flaws. I mean, it's not possible to make a system that's adjusted to everyone. So you'll always need some sort of complementary responses. And in many cases, that's how you can frame the relevance and the role of communities in a system that's highly medicalized. Is yes, perfect. I mean, the system's nice. It fits like 95% of the population, but the other 5% don't fit in the system. So there's something that's necessary to reach these other 5%, or whatever percentage it is, or even if there's not a percentage. And in the case of Iceland, and similarly to other Nordic countries, these are societies which, to my knowledge, tend to be inclusive conceptually, even if then in practice there are flaws. And so it should not be very difficult, especially in a country that has a lot of remote areas, that you touch, for example, on issues around coverage, that it's not possible to reach everyone with a coverage that's focused exclusively on one type of facility. And so diversifying the type of facility can help reach other people who are not covered, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll have a lot of options, and it will also depend on what your objectives are. So do you work on advocacy, actually, which is something I did not ask in the beginning, or do you expect to work on advocacy over the coming times? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. And what, out of all of this stuff, what do you think would be your main challenge or your main challenges? So what do you think is the hardest thing when you're thinking about your advocacy work, either the one that you're doing or the one that you will be doing in the future? What do you think are the hardest things or the hardest points to get right?
Understanding the political system, at least at the national level here in Belgium. So the actual access to decision makers.
So actually find the avenues to get there, or understanding how finding the avenues. So how is the political system, like in 2 sentences, how is the political system structured in Belgium?
It can't be 2 sentences. We have like 5 parliaments, or 4, I don't even remember. We have several parliaments, regional ones, local ones, national one. So it's just complicated and messy.
That's a lot of parliaments for a small country, no?
Yeah.
It is indeed. There are
It has to
several
do with
layers.
It has to do with the different language backgrounds, doesn't it? Well, populations, which then translated into languages, and
Exactly.
but the decision is made. So depending on where you start, the decision is then made higher level first or lower level first.
It depends on the thematic.
Okay, so if it's a national law, it's high, and then it unfolds into the different.
Yeah, usually.
And if it's regional, it starts lower, and then if necessary, it goes up for approval.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not that complicated.
Okay.
Theoretically,
yeah.
theoretically.
Yeah, true. It's just but what I meant is that it's hard to know who actually takes the decision on what, basically.
But you do have, so I presume that they all have like predefined competences. So these are supposed to decide on that, and those are supposed to decide on that. And then if these can't, they have to send it to the other ones. So it's a tricky process to identify where you start, I would imagine. Oh, but yeah, 7 parliaments is quite interesting. Well, but Belgians like to talk, so I guess it makes sense. And for the rest of the people?
I think it's still not really understanding, but overcoming the barriers coming from the political system. And also, I think having a, how to say, on a very high level, having a buy-in from the politics and from the organization, because I'm considering that HIV is not anymore a very sexy topic,
Yeah.
I would say.
Very true.
And there is no, I wouldn't even say there is a social demand for HIV related projects. So I think that's a barrier that I'm seeing.
Definitely. I think that's also a barrier, not only in your national context, but in general. And there have been discussions around. So HIV has lost its exceptionality over the last few years, although there is still a lot of direct funding for HIV, even from the standpoint of international donors like Global Fund, PEPFAR, etc. But the fact is that probably HIV over the coming years will have to be seen as one of several infections or infectious diseases or health-related issues. And that may also change the way that we who work in community-based organizations have to look to and present all of our issues, because we will probably need to frame them in wider ways. And I mean, as Andrew was mentioning, these broader frameworks like universal health coverage, sustainable development goals, etc., kind of help us get the bigger picture so that we can then narrow it down to our specific issues. Because I do agree that political buy-in these days, I mean, in health especially, political buy-in these days only exists for COVID or COVID-related matters. I mean, no one cares about anything else. People are dying of a ton of other things, but that doesn't seem to be a problem if you don't have a COVID positive test. And creating that demand will, in many cases, be impossible. So you can't make it a priority. You can't convince people that that's the most important issue. You can, however, convince them that it's sufficiently important to have a discussion on and to make a decision about. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be the top of the agenda. And sometimes it's good that it's not the top of the agenda because it doesn't go to the media. It can be negotiated backstage, let's say, or in meeting rooms, provided you can get access to the decision makers. If you can't get access to the decision makers, I have absolutely no doubt that you can access people who, in turn, will access the decision makers, even if it's the opposition. From a parliament standpoint, if the people who are in power don't care about what you're saying, the opposition will, even if it's just because they're the opposition. And so sometimes, if you see that it's not possible to reach the decision maker, you have to reach the people who can push the decision maker. And sometimes that comes through the opposing parties. Sometimes that comes through, again, the demonstrations that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes that comes from civil society. Sometimes it comes from agencies. It depends a lot. In the case of Poland, for example, there was pressure from civil society in Poland, a couple of organizations working on HIV, towards agencies, for agencies to actually have a more active dialogue with the officials in Poland. And they won't negotiate, or they won't have a dialogue with the prime minister or the president or whatever, but they will have a dialogue with authorities, health authorities. I was involved in a project that included Poland, a joint action called Integrate. And through the joint action, we actually managed to change, we didn't manage to change, we managed to contribute to the change of the mandate of the HIV program in Poland, which now has an extended mandate that does not only cover HIV, it covers also other infections. So the small things are possible sometimes. And again, sometimes it doesn't have to be necessarily through the decision maker. But this to tell you how did it happen. If they didn't change the mandate, if they didn't enlarge the mandate, they would lose quite a few a few tens of thousands of euros in European funding, and probably lose access to future funding for similar projects. And so there was an economical narrative there that was also important on top of the public health narrative. I don't know who made the decision, but it was a process who was blocked for a long time. And then at a certain point, the direction of the joint action sent a letter and said, well, if this doesn't happen, if this is not possible, then we're going to cancel the rest of the activity. Because you committed to this, so if it's not possible, it's fine, no problem, but we have to cancel everything else that's connected to your activities. And in a few months, it was possible. So sometimes you just have to find a way to go around, and that's not always easy, actually. So it's a very creative process, I have to say. Because when you start, it's very rare that you have a very, very clear solution and a pathway that, now we just do this and it's going to be solved. Especially because for the most part, you're working with people. And again, not only people who do not know that much about the subject for the most part, but also with a lot of different people with different backgrounds, different training, different opinions, different prejudice, different social norms, different many things. And sometimes everything seems to be going fine, and then suddenly everything goes back to square one and you don't even really understand exactly why. But you just come up with a new plan and keep going. That's in my opinion, one of the big challenges is actually dealing with processes that seem that they will never change in a way that is positive enough to keep you engaged and and motivated to keep working on things, because sometimes it will take you years.
I have a question, Daniel.
Go ahead.
Do you consider violent protests counterproductive to advocacy, or do you consider it complementary?
What do you define as a violent protest?
Yeah, that's why I put the quotes.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm asking. Because I have a definition of violence, but it may be different from person to person.
When it involves breaking stuff on fire.
Yes, I consider it counterproductive. Not specifically for advocacy, for society in general. let's go back to the issues around. So let's go to the example of the Black Lives Matter protests. The majority of things that were broken in the product, and they were widely covered, which is why I'm using this one as an example. If you saw the images, the majority of things that were broken were actually from people who had nothing to do with that. So what you are destroying is the lives of normal people. So how is that a good thing for your point? You're breaking stores of people who probably work their entire lives to have that business running. You're breaking house glasses of people who, I mean, who have their normal lives. You have no idea if they're favorable to you, against you. Violence is rarely the answer for anything, in my opinion. That's a personal opinion. Feel free to disagree, it's fine. But protesting in a violent way, your impact will not be on the people that you're looking to impact. It will be on the community that you are protesting on. And that means that you will be making the lives of the people of that community, wherever the community is. So if you're protesting on a street, the people who are trading and living on that street will be the people impacted by your protest. And I don't think that helps your cause. I mean, I understand the logic of making noise and creating attention, but at the cost of people's well-being, of people's lives, of people's work, I'm against it. If you want to break something, go break the Capitol. There I have nothing against it.
Okay, so it depends what is broken, basically.
I mean, ultimately, I would say if you really need to do a violent protest, yes, it depends on what you're breaking. But you really need to assess the need, because if you need to do a violent protest, why? And I mean, and in the case of Black Lives Matter, the protests weren't supposed to be violent, as far as I understood. But I mean, when you have a mass of people, it's easy for things to get out of hand. And it's hard to say many times, not only in that case, in many other cases, it's hard to say where does the violence begin, because if you have the police shooting at you, rubber bullets and water cannons, that's also violence. And so there's the balance here that's very difficult. And I mean, yes, the protesters broke things, but a lot of them also got beaten up, got put into the hospital. So there's violence on both ends. As I said, I don't think violence is the answer. But if you have no other alternative and you need to resort to something violent, then direct your violence at the cause. Don't just randomly break shit. I mean, why? You're probably breaking things of people who are part of your own community. What's the sense of that? So you're making things hard. You're actually doing exactly what the people that you're complaining about are doing as well, in a different way. So you want to break stuff, break them. Break them, like target things correctly. But like I said, I don't think violence is ever the answer. And I am convinced that you can generate enough attention without breaking stuff. I mean, if you can get 10,000 people on the streets, it will generate attention. You don't have to break stuff. If there are 10,000 people on the streets for the same thing, there's attention. No government in any place in the world can ignore 10, maybe in China, in the middle of Beijing. But apart from that, you cannot ignore 10,000 people on the streets protesting about whatever it is.
I think you can, and I'm referring to the recent Polish protests against the abortion law, which is very strict. And I was also about to ask you about the verbal violence, because these protests are pretty violent in terms of the speech, I would say, which is coming from the, I don't know, I think people are just hopeless. They cannot do anything else. But also what happens is that we are gathering around the house of Kaczynski, who is our a good candidate for our Salazar, I think. And I'm thinking now, based on what you say, would you justify that? Is that okay? I think it is, but it's not that black and white, I would say.
Yeah, I agree that it's not black and white. I would say that, I mean, again, that's why I asked what violence meant, because if violence is having very aggressive messages, sometimes that is the only way. you're a fucking idiot, get the hell out of here, is a valid message if that's true.
Is that the tagline of the protest is "Get the fuck out"? So that's that's what I'm referring to, basically.
Absolutely nothing against it.
I mean, there is nothing else to say at this
Exactly,
point.
but that's exactly the point.
Thing.
I mean, if
Yep.
you cannot reason with the person or the institution, then it comes to a point where you have to be a bit more assertive. And assertive can signify exactly, get the hell out of here, you're useless. But I mean, again, there is no black and white. And in that case and in other cases, I mean, there are people that you cannot negotiate with. There are people that, regardless of you being right, of being the right thing, they don't care. And so you can't expect those people to be the motor of change. The motor of change has to come from somewhere else. So you have to keep making noise. And if 10 decibels is not enough, you need to find a way to make 100. And if 100 is not enough, you need to find a way to make 1,000. And ultimately, this is something that we always need to remember. I mean, and there's a delicate balance here. So government officials are elected officials, which means that the people put them there. And the people can get them out of there. In every system, in every political system in the world, there is a way to depose a government or a person in the government.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. Totally.
And oftentimes the issue is that although, sorry for the presumption, but although we may be right, the vast majority of the population doesn't care. Because we are right, yes, but they still got there with a majority of popular vote. So maybe he is just a reflection. And let me go back to the Trump situation. I mean, Trump, in my personal opinion, is an asshole and should have never been allowed to candidate himself. But ultimately, anyone can be a candidate. I could be a candidate, and I'm sure that a lot of people would think that I would be an asshole. But I mean, he was put there because in his system, he got most votes. And so he has a right to be there, regardless of our opinion about him. And so the only way to get him out of there is to remove those votes. That's why politicians are so touchy with things that can make them lose votes. That's why you will very, very rarely see leading candidates touch on very sensitive issues when elections are coming, because they don't want to risk losing a part of their electorate. And again, in all political systems, there is a way to remove a government. It depends on the political system. In our case, the president of the republic has the power to remove the government. But there is another legal mechanism that I'm not 100% familiar with, that, I mean, it was never used, that can also be activated, but that has to do with, again, legal issues. So if they violate the constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways, but they require in several cases that you have specific allies, and those specific allies can be the population itself, which, again, regardless of our opinion being the right one or not, unfortunately, sorry, democracy works out of majority, and the majority is not always an informed majority, and this is a problem. Again, many decisions that politicians make, but also that people make, are not based in rational thought. They're based in prejudice and stigma and misinformation. That is why, again, our communication is very important. That's why education is key to any country, because if people learn how to think and how to look for information, the risk of this type of people getting to power becomes lesser. But again, I have nothing against verbal aggression, provided that it's justified, and the justification comes from the people who are protesting. I mean, if you, I mean, in your case, I cannot disagree. But it's my opinion. I'm pretty sure that there are people in Poland who think, I mean, these guys are completely nuts. What are they saying? They're savages. And again, public opinion will make a big difference. And ultimately, the next election will also make a big difference. So if it's not possible to do something until then, it's possible to do something then.
So you just touched on public opinion, and you said that we kind of need to raise their education. So how do we do that from an organization point of view about HIV testing or TB or Hep C testing is important for the whole population?
So it depends on the issue. If we're speaking about testing, the fact is it's not important for the whole population. For a lot of people, it doesn't matter if they get an HIV test or not, because their probability of having an HIV infection or hepatitis C infection is so low, especially in Iceland, that it's hard to justify like mass public opinion campaigns, etc. So even if you cannot, so you have two options. Either you do focused communication, so you focus all your efforts in communicating with the people who are concerned about the issue, medical community, health decision makers, other civil society organizations, key populations. So you create a demand from the parts of society who actually have an interest on that or who can see your point. Or you have to change your approach. And it doesn't have to be necessarily, this is important for everyone. It can be one of two things. Either, so, and now it's a concrete example with Iceland. And we've touched this on a previous session very broadly. I mean, Iceland has the opportunity of being the first country in the world with 0 HIV infections. Very easily. You're very few people overall. You have a very good infrastructure in terms of health system. You have enough medical professionals and enough community-based organizations and enough pharmacies that you can, if you put a comprehensive testing system there, in 2 years, you can have everyone with HIV diagnosed with no problems and in treatment, and it doesn't cost a lot of money because you're very few and you have a lot of money anyway. It doesn't matter. So you can either put this in this framing, like we have the opportunity of being or the first country in the world to actually do this. And it's not even that expensive. And I think it's hard for a decision maker to say, oh, I don't care. It looks nice politically. It gets them votes. Or you can go through the social side of it and say, I mean, this is an issue that touches on people who are more underserved, more underprotected. And as a matter of social justice and equality or equity, it makes sense that we invest some money into ensuring that these people have access to proper care, as we would want it for any one of us if it was our case. And as again, Iceland is a more left-wing oriented, conceptually speaking, policy, has a more left-wing oriented policy approach. It also makes sense from a theoretical standpoint. Then I don't know the people themselves, so I don't know what their positions specifically are on this. Or you can combine both of them and just build a very, very nice narrative of, I mean, we can be the best, we can be the first ones. We have a lot of advantages. It's a small country, it's low transmission. We're finding we need to find 50 or 60 people. We even know who the people are who are in most risk. We don't really have to invest that much money. We already have all the structures put in place. We don't even have to change the law. Make a scenario where it's hard to say no. And in that specific case, I think you have a few options. Then again, I don't know the people, so I don't know what could work or not. But I think there are options to kind of give them this very, very nice golden egg that's very easy to grab. Questions, comments? Are you happy?
Yeah. Personally, I'm very happy for the session of today. So it kind of put in more information and how we can focus
I'm happy
to make a change in our community. So
I'm very happy to hear that. So I please feel free if not only today, if you have something that you'd like to discuss, or if you have questions that pop up after, because I know that this is also a lot of information, the presentation will be available if you want to go back and check stuff. If you have questions or if you'd like to discuss something in the future, feel free. You can reach me easily by email, so I will remain available. And I hope this was useful. And all the best of luck. Do believe that you can change things.
Thank you. Yes, I do. We'll keep in touch, definitely.
And we have another session on Tuesday anyway.
Yeah, exactly. On networking.
Yeah.
Do you work with the Janagapia in Coalition Plus?
No, not yet. I just joined Coalition Plus, so I'm starting to get familiar with everyone.
Okay.
But I probably will sooner or later because I'm going to work with all of the organizations. So.
Okay, should we close it here?
Yeah. So if there is nothing else from your side, yes. Again, please feel free whenever you want. I hope it was useful, and I'll see you next week because we have another couple of hours of chatting.
Tuesday. Yeah. Have a nice weekend, everybody.
You too.
Thank you, you too.